Hello, this is Mike Lee from the Cornell Center for Historical Keyboards. And for this week's program, it is my great honor and privilege to have as guest with us Tilman Skowroneck, who is lecturer at the Academy of Music, University of Gothenburg, who is zooming in with me from Sweden. Tilman is very much has a strong Cornell connection. He was a visiting scholar, visiting student here in the late 90s, working with Malcolm Bilson. And I believe, Tilman, that was when you were engaging in your doctoral research, which then became the subject of your 2003 book, which we will talk about, which we will introduce to our audience if they don't know it already, and which will anchor this week's program. So Tilman, thank you for joining us. Welcome, warm welcome.
Thank you.
So I want to start, just say a couple of words to sort of contextualize this program, Beethoven Opus 7 and the Stein instrument. So as part of this semester series that we're doing here at Cornell at the Keyboard Center, we're calling it Beethoven and Pianos, Off the Beaten Path. And this program comes after Tom Beggin's feature, which many of you would have seen, Beethoven and his Erard piano, the French Beethoven. And we know that, we have a pretty good sense of the kinds of pianos that Beethoven had encountered and engaged with. And there are a couple of instruments, the Erard, for instance, that have traditionally been thought to have been, say, rejected by Beethoven. He was intrigued and then he rejected it. And I think through Tom's really astonishing project, there is a lot more nuance than the traditional narrative. And so I thought, in that spirit, we would think about Tilman's kind of new groundbreaking research in terms of the significance of the Stein instrument in Beethoven's early pianistic development, how he became the piano virtuoso that we knew he was when he went to Vienna. And Tilman's book, the earlier part of Tilman's book, which we will show in the slide, really is quite groundbreaking in that regard. And so I thought, why don't we investigate and invite Tilman to this conversation and investigate the Stein instrument in relation to a large early period work, pre-1800 work, Opus 7 Sonata, and also as a way to introduce the Stein copy that we have here at the Cornell Keyboard Center, which is a Tom McCobb copy that I will be playing Opus 7 on. So that's just a very general framing. And Tilman, my first question would be, what led you to this research in the first place? Can you just give us a little bit of background, your doctoral research, and what led you especially to thinking about Beethoven's, rethink Beethoven's early pianistic engagement, and also why has this not been common knowledge before your work came along?
Well, that's already a big question. To make this quick, why I started to this research was actually, it was triggered by Malcolm's and his, how many, 6 or 7 students?
6 former students, yes.
Recording of all the Beethoven sonatas on early pianos, which I got familiar with when we were driving back from concert tours here in Sweden, and it all of a sudden came on the radio from the Utrecht Festival live. And I thought, hey, there's something happening here. And so I got the CD box and I read the booklet and I thought, this is interesting. But then I thought, especially about the early sonatas, like the Kurfürsten sonatas from Beethoven's youth. I thought, okay, I could directly imagine other instruments to be played here too. And so I wasn't automatically contrary to what happened on this box. But I thought, okay, well, it could actually kind of be even, you know, spread even wider.
Right.
And the other thing is, why hasn't this been done before? Well, the thing is that Stein has been mentioned in most all Beethoven biographical material about his youth.
Yes.
So that is not new.
Right.
What is new is that people always kind of put these names like Walter or Stein in traditional Beethoven research. They just kind of put them in there as little stickers.
Right.
Oh yeah, Stein. Stein is important for Mozart. Stein was famous in the 18th century. Stein was also known to Beethoven. And then we kind of just move on, you know?
Yeah.
And it, you know, because it seems like not quite as important as the name dropping to actually understand what these instruments do or don't do. And I think that's where I sort of swooped in, because I was interested in what these instruments do. And that is partly then also based on my own personal background. I grew up among harpsichords, okay, yes, but my parents also had an original fortepiano, which afterwards was identified as a Walter from around 1790. So it's one of the, or maybe the first surviving Walter with Viennese action, with the brass capsule action.
Yeah.
And that's the instrument I grew up with, so I knew how these things actually sounded. And yeah, so that's...
What privilege to grow up with the original Walter piano.
Well, I shouldn't say that, but you know, as a kid, I actually didn't like the piano very much. I could have benefited more.
Yes, so you then sort of started to put the meat on the bone, as it were. I mean, Steins have been mentioned, but to get into the material capabilities and this real world distinctions. And so can you just very briefly sort of walk us through some of the major kind of discoveries that you do present in your book about Beethoven's early kind of pianistic training? Obviously, it's not just piano that he was engaged with. It's a lot of clavichord and possibly the organ as well. And Stein was also an organ builder. So is that a consistent kind of thread?
Well, the problem is, I think, for us to really kind of pinpoint these things, that many instruments were hidden in plain sight, as we say. So especially the clavichord is not being mentioned, specifically because everything was called clavier. And I just kind of made a few thought experiments when you're looking at Beethoven's youth. For example, there's this anecdote by Wegeler, I think it is, that Beethoven practiced mostly all night through. Now, there were brothers involved, and
Right.
there was a family involved, and there were people living downstairs. And if he had played on like a relatively audible instrument, that would probably not have gone over very well.
Right.
So at that point, when Wegeler sees Beethoven standing at the clavier and weeping because he's being forced to do all these exercises, poor little guy, that must, I feel, have been a clavichord. Now, a little later, like 5 years later or so, we have the landlord, who was a baker, actually kicking the whole Beethoven family out of the house for a period of time because there was so much noise going on in the big living room. And so there was a different keyboard instrument at that point in that living room, and Beethoven was practicing the heck out of it. And so, yeah, you have these kind of little back ways to maybe invent or fantasize about what type of instruments were.
Right.
And you know, if you compare that to the typical situation of a household at that time in the 1780s, that makes sense. But you know, there's no hard value there. We don't know what instrument. There's nothing. But with the Stein instruments, and that's the contrast. That's why I'm talking about these things.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, we do know that one had some Stein pianos, and we do know from other reports that Beethoven was used to playing on Stein instruments, and so that is not a contained issue. Then the question is, what kind of Stein instruments were there at the time? Because Johann Andreas Stein also went through various phases, even though his basic construction was the same. We could always discuss like what type of instruments were we actually talking about? Are we talking about the early ones that have hollow hammers? And
right. If it's covered leather or not, right?
Solid hammers and already leather coverings, and how did they have the sound, and so on.
Now, this distribution of Stein instruments in Bonn at that time, I mean, if we have records that, if I'm correct, there were several known Stein pianos in different households there that Beethoven encountered. Would you say that that's quite widely distributed in Bonn, or perhaps at this time, you know, there were obviously a lot more clavichords and harpsichords, that having a new Stein instrument was seen as quite a novelty, as a kind of luxury item that people would have taken note?
Well, it's an interesting thing. We have like the two reports that are actually important in this connection is one letter by Johann, what is his name? Christoph, no, Neefe. Sorry, I'm bungling this up. Neefe is the teacher of Beethoven. We know all Neefe, but I don't know his first names because these German names always Johann Xavier or something like that. The first letter is, so it's a correspondence to Kramer's Magazin der Musik. It's a typical thing. People had observers on the floor in various German cities, and they would regularly write in some observations about the music life. That's something that later the AMZ also did. So it's a typical format. And Neefe was like the musical observer, and he writes from Bonn in 1783 that there are a number of amateurs who have all kinds of instruments and so on, claviers and whatever else and stuff like that. And he also talks about Beethoven, who is promising. And then a few years later, he writes again that the music life in Bonn is really picking up. And I think that's 1787, you may correct me here. Yes, indeed. Where he just writes, the love of music is increasing greatly among the inhabitants. The clavier is especially liked. There are several hammer clavier by Stein and other equivalent masters. So he does not mention that in the first letter at all. He mentions instruments like pretty detailed, down to a pyramid-shaped hammer clavier / organ combination instrument that some amateur had at home that wasn't even finished. So he's kind of detailed enough when it comes to interesting instruments, but he does not mention actually any of those Steins then. And in 87, all of a sudden, yes, there are several Stein instruments. And there must have been a fortepiano at the court also in the early 90s at the latest, because we have sketches from Beethoven from the Holy Week of, I think, 92, where he indicates to use the knee levers for lifting and damping.
Right.
So there must have been a quick development in the 1780s simply.
Yeah. So to kind of get us to the crux of this discussion, and you do correct me if my understanding is inaccurate, but my understanding is that Steiners mechanism, which is distinguished in one respect of many, in the fact that it doesn't have a back check. It doesn't catch the hammers after the hammer strike the strings. And by, say, the 1790s, that's already a kind of older style. Stein's pianos was kind of understood as an older design, if you would, because other makers, the majority of other Viennese piano makers like Walter and Schantz, they made pianos that checked, and also with a brass capsule, and that changed kind of the fundamental characteristic of these pianos in quite an important way. Is that a fair framing?
I think it's fair in its rough outlines, but it also assumes that there is some kind of thing that can be done better than another thing. And of course, we're a little careful about that. It's very important to look at the writings, for example, by Johann Andreas Streicher, the son-in-law of Johann Andreas Stein, married to Nanette Streicher,
right,
who in the 1790s in Vienna, after the firm had moved to Vienna, was first the business correspondent of the firm of the Streichers, and then later, when the so-called Geschwister Stein, Nanette and Matthias Andreas split up, he actually became a piano builder. And what he writes in a little booklet about the maintenance of these instruments, which was sketched in 1800 and issued in 1801, is what it kind of points at is that they were very much thinking in terms of a holistic approach. So the instrument had to behave in a certain type of way. It had to be stable. It had to function to serve the pianist. And it had to have certain characteristics. And the action, if properly set up, was that type of action that the Steins found most successful in this type of instrument. So they did not, as I feel when I read these texts, they did not think that it was necessary to move over to the Viennese action.
Right.
And the part of the solution here is that these instruments were very resonant, so they didn't need a lot of forceful playing in order to sound bright and penetrating in a positive way. And partly it is based on the fact that Johann Andreas Streicher himself was a pianist, a good pianist.
Yes, and a pedagogue.
He had his own ideas about what good piano playing should be about. And so there's a link there in a way. So
now,
I think the Viennese builders might have thought that the Steins were old-fashioned, but the Steins might have thought that they had it at the right end, so to speak.
I understand your point. I mean, a beautifully set up Stein action, with the wooden capsule and just regulated just right. I mean, it's very, very beautiful to play on, but it is markedly different. I mean, in my own experience, and I wonder if you would agree, say, if you compare a beautifully regulated Stein next to a beautifully regulated Walter, I mean, they are quite fundamentally different in important ways, even though they're all 5-octave pianos from the period, what we now call just the Viennese piano. But if we get into the nuances, and my personal feeling, and I would like your opinion on this, is the Stein and the clavichord seem to have a kind of link, if one could say that. In other words, having a kind of clavichord, if you practice on the clavichord for a while, then you master the Stein action better. It requires greater control, simply because there are no checks. You kind of do have to manage how the camera comes back down and not overplay it, for instance. Whereas the Walter type pianos that do have checks seem to sort of depart from that a bit more. Would you say that that's fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair. One of the things about the back check, of course, we have a history of thinking about that since the 1990s somewhere, where Michael Latcham, the organologist, published an article about the function of the check. And I think Mozart pianos works in the initial case. I remember when I came to Cornell, one of the first things that Malcolm talked to me about was this article, which in the beginning was so groundbreaking that he just kind of didn't believe that could be true. And why did he not think that? Because he said, I took out the checks in my Walter and I tried to play and it was absolutely impossible. Now that's the thing. Right. The Stein action is conceived in a way that it all makes sense. It comes together in a way that if it is set up well, the check is in a way not necessary. Before you start overplaying the instrument, and risk that the hammers strike twice or three times, or as Malcolm says, the hammer bubbles. You already have found the edge of what the strings or the instruments actually want to do. So you're not, and that brings it close to the clavichord in a whole nother way. And I think that the analogy or the line to the lineage to the clavichord is very important in how these instruments came about and what the ambitions of Johann Andreas Stein actually were, who also invested an enormous amount of time in making what we today unfairly call experimental instruments. And those instruments were mostly geared at making it possible to bridge the gap from no sound at all via very soft sounds to something that could be perceived in a hall. He wanted to have the entire scale of subtleties at his fingertips. And I think the action of Stein and then later the Streichers, if done well, offers exactly this possibility. And that is exactly what comes from the clavichord.
Yes.
Unless a clavichord action is really bad, which sometimes also happens, like too much key depth or some stupid friction or something like that. But if there's nothing of that kind, and the instrument is responsive, you have a control from 0 up to whatever the instrument wants to give you.
Yes.
So that is tightly interlinked, definitely.
Oh, I understand. I mean, my my experience with Steins is with copies, and I've had the great opportunity to have played on a beautifully regulated Stein copy by Paul McNulty, and
yes,
to kind of get a hands-on understanding of how the action worked. I mean, how you regulate the swing of the hammers in such a way that it's neither too loose nor too stiff. So now, to kind of steer the conversation sort of towards the 1790s,
yes,
when I think we think that there is a kind of transition in Beethoven's perhaps playing style. The fact that, you know, in the Vienna years, he played on Walters, and he had Walters in his apartment. And so the crux, I mean, of the little evidence that we have, one of the crux is this letter exchange between Beethoven and Streicher in November 1796. So just to sort of give our audience a little background, Beethoven had a concert, an academy set up in Pressburg, which is modern day Bratislava, a kind of suburb outside Vienna, you know, an hour by train or something like that in our time. And he asked the Streicher firm, now run by Nanetta Stein Streicher.
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, it's the Geschwister. It's yes, with her brother. There's the siblings.
Yes.
Firm. And they sent him a piano for this Accademia, in which I believe he played the C major concerto. And so there is this letter, which we will put up on our event page, in which there's a critical sentence. He sort of praises the piano to Streicher, but he also, there's a whiff of criticism. He says, "Well, but I do feel like I cannot kind of make my own tone." I think those were his words in your translation. "Make my own tone on this beautiful instrument, but maybe I'm just one of the few idiosyncratic people who want to make my own tone." Could you tell us a bit about that, and what your opinion, you know, I mean, what I think with this project, I'm trying to understand this kind of shift in Beethoven's pianistic perspective, and then use, you know, Opus 7, which we know was drafted around exactly that time, end of 1796, as a kind of test case to see how he straddles between, say, an older style of playing, older style of, or his, for himself, an earlier kind of encounter with the Stein and later encounters with the Walters after kind of the Vienna years.
Mm. Well, it's like something I talked with my wife, Robin Blanton, about what we do in organology and what we also do in this research of letters. We practice repetition in our scholarship. And so every time you return to a letter, you see something else. So I'm not sure that like everything I wrote and or published in 2010 is still kind of entirely valid. One of the things that struck me when I thought this thing through again is that there is a bit of a back and forth going on for Beethoven in the 1790s, and we don't actually exactly know what kind of back and forth. So we know that when he came to Vienna, he rented some kind of large fortepiano for not very much money. And we know that only a year and a half later, he was actually resident at Count Lichnowsky's, who was a pianist, and his brother was a pianist. His wife was a pianist, so they had pianos. And we don't know what kind of pianos they were, but we could imagine that they were actually Viennese pianos because the nobility in Vienna was pretty local patriotic. Then he was friends with Nicolas von Zmeskal, who was an amateur cellist of very good quality. And in at least one exchange, which is also around 1795 or so, we have Beethoven rent Zmeskal's garden house, or I don't know what exactly, with the piano for some period of time. No idea what piano that was, but later Zmeskal is one of the persons who actually forged contacts between Beethoven and Anton Walter. So we guess again, Anton Walter. So there was some kind of immersion into the Vienna piano world, either by having instruments or having access to instruments via his patrons or something like that. That's going on until 1796, let's say, and then Beethoven travels to Berlin.
Right.
So he's away for half a year or something like that. Right. Upon his return, the Streichers are firmly established in Vienna, and we have these letters. Yes. And so there is some kind of direct contact making going on towards the second half of 1796. And what I think now possibly happened was that Beethoven, in this particular short period, was trying or was experimenting with reconnecting to those instruments. Mm-hmm. And so in the first letter we have, which is undated, but probably also from the same time to Streicher, he's talking about a little private concert where a pupil by Streicher had played a work by Beethoven, and he compliments him as a piano teacher about his conception of playing the fortepiano, which is better than just kind of harping around. And so probably, as we think now, a few months later, he's in Bratislava and he has rented or borrowed or whatever this Streicher piano and is playing a concert on it, practicing on it. And all of a sudden he says, well, these instruments are perfect. They're perfect for everybody, but not for like this whimsical me who wants to make his own tone on these instruments. So he kind of swoops in, he tests, he evaluates, and he passes judgment. And 3 years later, he has Anton Walter in his own room, which we know from Channel. Right. So yeah, that's basically the story.
Yeah, no, I mean, and certainly, that trip just prior to this letter to Berlin, and I think via Prague, am I right?
That's right, yes.
Prague and Berlin.
I think.
I mean, he, up in Berlin, he would have encountered possibly other kinds of pianos, and we just don't know. And his, if it's somebody like him, I could imagine each encounter with a new instrument that adds to his sensibilities and conception of what pianos do and what he wants to do as a piano player and composer. And I think that's something, we've starting to kind of hone in on in our series. I mean, coming after Tom Begin's presentation, is that it's just always, it's never a singular type of piano aesthetic or listening or in any one work. I mean, Tom's wonderful thing on the Waldstein, but I think many people also felt, and Tom says so himself too, that while the French aspect is obviously there and he's inspired, but there are also other things coming into play, perhaps even orchestral textures, conceptions, and other kinds of pianos background. These are always overlaying. So it's not that, he was thinking of the Steinway, but it's, on the other hand, it is also not that's just early Beethoven. You play it on the Walter and it's perfect and it's done. So coming back to around 1796 and Opus 7, which is the Grand Sonata that he dedicated to Barbara or Babette Keglovich, with whom he stayed, I think, around that time. He was giving her lessons, and he obviously had a relationship with the family, and also dedicated the C major concerto among a couple of other things to her. I mean, big virtuoso, ambitious pieces. And she was kind of just a teenager at that time, and we usually assume that if she's the dedicatee of such works, that she must have been a pretty good pianist herself. So coming back to Opus 7, and I mean, to my knowledge, and I don't know about you, what you know, I've not heard in the world of early pianos, I've not heard a work such as Opus 7 being played on a kind of Stein type instrument, but I might be wrong.
No, I haven't heard.
Because it's typically considered sort of mature early Beethoven, and he's left Bonn, and this is a very public kind of work, and so I'm just intrigued in how you think about the work, Tilman, through these lenses of different pianos. I mean, through the Stein lens, perhaps even through kind of English pianism, music of Dussek and so on, Clementi, Dussek, textures and technical features. What are your thoughts about this work?
Well, there have been, of course, like well-established studies about making connections between the English style and a certain type of motoric or motivic content of this type of work. There are other works that are more important in a particular context, but Opus 7 figures, I think, in one of these articles. Trying to play Opus 7 on like around 1800 Broadwood doesn't tell you very many more stories. It's very difficult to control, I think, the sound so it doesn't just get bouldering. You can try that yourself, I think.
We have
or something like that. It's just something.
We have a 70. It's being worked on. We have a 1799 Broadwood right here.
Yeah. So the funny thing is that my own relationship with Opus 7 is actually practicing it on a copy of a 1790 Clavichord.
Oh my gosh!
Okay. A fretted Clavichord with 5 octaves after Brosi in Basel. And of course, that puts a certain type of limitations on the experience. But on the other hand, there's an astonishing amount of stuff in this piece that works perfectly fine on an instrument like that for preparation simply.
Right. Like you mean like sort of behind the scenes preparation for this. Can you tell us a bit? I'm intrigued about that. Can you tell? I mean, because I'm playing it and.
Well, for example, this is one of the works where in the opening allegro already there are quite a lot of really pianissimo passages.
Yeah,
that need to be shaped in some kind of way. Of course, this is something that in the middle style, like think of the Appassionata, which in everybody's mind probably is a loud piece, but if you kind of make up statistics about how many passages are supposed to be piano or pianissimo, and that sonata is absolutely stunning. And the pianissimo is always a significant indication, I think, in Beethoven, because it's not easy to play that softly, and it is not self-evident that a passage should be pianissimo.
Yes.
Very often, like if you just kind of come to this music intuitively, and you don't look at the dynamics, you could play it like maybe mezzo forte or something like that. Like, for example, in Opus 7, when you're looking at bar 26, 27,
Right.
this kind of little woodwind answer after the big chord.
Yeah.
It's extremely stated, and on a clavichord you can get away with that. And you can, on a good clavichord, also play something that resembles the character of fortissimo, even though this relative, of course, soft.
Right.
So,
no, that's a great point about the pianissimos. I mean, because I've been practicing it a bit on our Stein copy, and I just find the pianissimos very, very hard to achieve and to tame, because the piano by nature is very, very lively and very, very bright in character, and the hammer swings so quickly with a shallow key depth that so it's torturous to work on the pianissimo aspect, and also in the second movement too, where they're fully voiced chords. Just a quick example, something like measure 22 in the second movement, approaching the final cadence, all these thickly voiced chords to be legato and also pianissimo. I mean, on any of these piano, I mean, maybe a Walter perhaps, because it's maybe easier to tame, but certainly on the Stein piano, I find that exceedingly difficult. And surely, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the clavichord, because surely there's some other kind of, again, overlay of instrumentality, if you would, that's informing his ears and hands. Yes. But you also mentioned to me privately before today about a kind of pedagogical angle, perhaps, if we, again, view Opus 7 through an earlier Stein lens. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I think it's an interesting thing when you look at Opus 7, which is a large and grand sonata, and then the shift to Opus 10. And you look at the repertory also around Opus 7, for example, the two first cello sonatas. There comes a moment, and it is very, very clear in Opus 10, number 3, the D major sonata, is when Beethoven experiments or accepts that he almost wants to get outside the compass of the 5-octave keyboard. At some point, it seems that he had an instrument with 5 octaves and 2 extra keys up to G, because there's this anecdote when he rehearsed one of the concertos, and we don't know in which version he rehearsed it, and also we don't know which concerto. We think it might be Opus 15, and he had to, because the piano was out of tune, and he had to transpose it half up. And if you try that with Opus 15, you end up with such a high percentage of notes that can't be played. So he must have had those extra keys, or otherwise I don't know what he did. But so that would explain also the few stray omitted or actually composed in F sharps that occasionally occur. And so in contrast, Opus 7 is muscling up to the ends of the keyboard, but it's never doing this in a frantic way. It seems like he's always totally fine with that confinement. And he uses it in what I think is very much a pedagogical way. When you're looking at the leap in bar 53,
right.
So he's in the middle of the keyboard on the A above the center C, and he jumps to the outer F
Yep.
while the left hand is engaged in some kind of active
Yep.
staccato thing, and which, at least for right-handed pianists, probably takes away a lot of energy, especially when you imagine this thing not like conservatory students do these days, like practiced for half a year and then performed at a concert, but done after a week or two of looking at it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so what happens here on an early piano is that you know, the first two times you do that, you probably kind of bang into the side of the instrument, and then you know what that leap is. And you know, it's almost like being on a like a kid on a bike with these extra support wheels, and then after a while they take the wheels away. Now the wheels are taken away in the recapitulation. Let's see which bar that is.
Yes, up to B flat, 231-ish.
Yeah, here.
231, I think.
231, yeah. Exactly. So he's going to the B flat, that's even a sharp, and he, you know, by that point, my little pupil, you will have learned how to do this jump, and so please do it in a transposed version. I mean, that's of course speculative, but I think it's very interesting that in the exposition, the jump is actually the safer one of the two.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excuse me. That's a similar point. I mean, I have a colleague, Roberto Poli, who's a Chopin scholar and tremendous performer. He makes a similar point about the ending of the second scherzo, the so-called B flat minor scherzo, that ends on a big D flat major chord, this leaping to the side. And then if you play it on a 6.5 octave piano, then the top F, you don't much have to look. It's the last note against the frame. And whereas on the modern piano, my goodness, you have to know where you're going. That's a good point.
The reverse is the reverse, and that's another pedagogical example. The reverse is true for these tremolos, which are sort of difficult to make sound good on many fortepianos. So the first one is in bar 111, and it is in the middle range, where it is actually easier to make sense of them sound-wise. But in the recapitulation, he starts on the high F, which is tricky to pull off. But by that time, the pianist has actually practiced them, and they will have practiced them from the.
Sorry, can you give me a bar number? I'm thinking you're referring to sort of the closing.
The recapitulation would be 291.
Oh yes, you mean a high E flat, I think. Is that
yeah. Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, he goes to the F later then. Yes, but that's like, to my mind at least, on very many fortepianos, the recap version of those tremoli is more difficult to make sound properly because it's so high.
So this gets me to another issue, and also why you know, I'm bringing our Cornell McCobb Stein copy into the discussion, is that let's take this first movement, which is the most overtly virtuosic of the three, and you know, you got these tremolos, and you got these right off the bat very, very fast repeated notes. And all these texture and you know, split octaves and so on, all these textures and figurations are made exceedingly more difficult on the checkless piano. I mean, let's say it's beautifully regulated, but without the check, am I right that my sense is that it does make repetition a bit more of an issue, even on the Stein instrument?
Well, I'm unsure about that. Yeah, I think we need more information about this. Yeah. So my own experiment with the phase 2, that is 1780s Stein action, is just the 5 notes or so that were regulated in the 1781 Gothenburg Claviorgan, and that it was actually Michael Latcham who did the regulation, because the Haag Gemeentemuseum had the instrument on loan for making x-rays and a drawing. And he set up a few real strings on these few without wanting to re-regulate the entire action, which I think is a good decision, because there's a lot of information in that action like it is now, with too many leather pads and all kinds of few little adjustments that have been made in order to keep it working for some amount of time. But okay, so he kind of put, at least he told me it was him, put this chord back in action. And so of course, because in Gothenburg you are actually allowed to try out the action, as opposed to some other museums I was in, I tried. And so what I came away with is that the sonar control was actually really good, even on this early action. There was a very clear roof.
Yes.
Strings didn't want to sound nice again. And above that roof, there was a moment when the hammer started to bubble. But I think that something like the opening theme of Opus 7 with it would not be a problem.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting too that it starts as piano, right? It's not, and so that goes with your perhaps this pedagogical idea of training. I mean, pianissimo playing on this kind of piano or this type of piano, and it's hugely difficult asks.
And if you kind of go to 79, where these repeated fortissimo chords are all the way in the bass,
right?
This is the moment when the pianist tests out how far he can go with the instrument. And on a Stein, I suppose the pedagogical effect, if you will, would be that the instrument tells you exactly how far you can go. Yes. While when you play this passage on a Walter, the action is not going to pass out on you, but you get all kinds of weird sounds from the dampers, and you get strings kind of clanging to the damper jacks or whatever else and stuff like that if you don't watch it, because you can actually bang as hard as you want.
Right.
That's maybe actually not the meaning of this passage, and I suppose the Stein would tell you exactly what that was.
That's an interesting point. Yes. I mean, the Stein type piano certainly it has a very clearly marked boundary, and you'll know it when you cross it. And if you live within it, then the whole world opens up, and it invites you to explore more the lower end, the greater finesses of your pianism. Well, thank you, Tilman. I think it's just such a pleasure to talk with you, and I hope this is a good forum for those who don't yet know your book to really investigate it. It's a great resource on all of these topics.
Yes.
There are other things you talk about in the book. I wish we could, have more events later on to explore. The trills, for instance, in Beethoven's piano writing, endlessly fascinating, and so on. But thank you so much for your time, and it's just wonderful for you to join us. Thank you.
I think what ultimately should actually happen, I think, is to inspire piano builders to look into the earlier Johann Andreas Stein actions more carefully.
Yes.
So especially phase 2 and early phase 3, because one of the things, what I did was to compare the phase 2 1782, I think it is, or 83 in piano, which is a full-fledged piano in Trondheim, and the 1781 Claviorgan here in Gothenburg. And then there's a very good description by John Coster in this big book about the Boston collection of a also phase 2, I think 1783 piano. And I looked at how the capsules were constructed and how the hammers were constructed, and at like minute changes and improvements that have been made to the construction. And you know, there are things that in the Trondheim that aren't in the Gothenburg, and the Gothenburg has more splits in the wood and the Trondheim does not. So they kind of evaluated what they were doing, and they were constantly developing better solutions. But it is astonishing, I think, when you look at these actions, how well they are made and how functional they are.
Yes.
And so I think there's a lot to be said to actually kind of properly try to replicate that type of setup, and to try to avoid the few very obvious mistakes that Johann Andreas Stein made in his instruments. For example, the attachment of his rest planks to the size of the instrument was not strong enough. And I think in 90% of the surviving instruments, it failed because of the string pressure. And so we know how to avoid that, right? Because I think what really has lingered is this sort of residue of mistrust that these actions were not really standing up to proper professional piano playing. And I think we have to actually first learn whether that is actually the case. Yeah, of course, the stuff about that the Czech actually works in a different way. Part of this information, I think I've got it in my footnotes. I talked to people like Stephen Burkett, and like we had discussions on various internet forums about these things. And there are some people who are not publishing a very much on the scholarly level, who have very strong opinions. And there are other people who publish a little, who have enormous experience. Like Chris Clark, for example, has actually revised the very first vis-a-vis of Johann Andreas Stein for concerts and recordings, which has a totally different action. But he, you know, he sent me photos and he sent me his opinions and stuff like that. So I was able to see from like various different angles from the builder's perspective that some people actually don't believe this narrative any longer.
Right. Right.
Yeah, the narrative that the Czech was necessary and that Walter solved the problem.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And one of the things we think about when we think of development in instrument building, of course, is that you solve one problem and you introduce another can of worms.
Sure.
And that's not a negative thing in and of itself. It's not that you kind of you fix one thing and you make other things worse, but it's there's always this direct match between expectations, and the expectations are partly mechanical from the builder's side and partly musical from whoever buys these instruments or uses them. It's always there's always this kind of surge to try to find an equilibrium between various solutions and various outcomes, and sometimes it turns out better, sometimes it doesn't turn out better. Because a lot of sympathy to be had for Andreas Streicher to not, in 1802, when they split up, the Geschwisterstein split up, and they all of a sudden had to embark on their own. Annette Streicher as a female master builder, and Andreas Streicher as the male support that was necessary in that society in order to make the thing fly. And also a very competitive market. And so what they wanted to do is to keep the things that they knew about safe. And so his first exchanges with the publisher in Leipzig, Hertel, he resists the suggestions to make the instruments louder, to make the instruments more like the Viennese instruments, all these kind of suggestions that Hertel, as somebody who knew the market, wanted to push, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to sell these instruments.
Right.
As Hertel says, they're old-fashioned. Streicher says, we know what we do.
Right.
Yeah, and then very slowly, when Streicher actually comes into more of a technical understanding of the building aspect himself as a person, he starts to develop his ideas, and he heals, and he, probably together with Nanette, or maybe Nanette was the one who was leading the new developments, but at least they open up. But it took them years